I introduced the topic in an earlier video, but there is indeed great excitement in London after the arrest of 2 suspected Chinese spies. Is the Sunak government being too soft on China, is asked now. There's even criticism from within their own party. So there is great excitement in British politics, and espionage is happening in the heart of democracy in the middle of Westminster, and it illustrates the vulnerability and perhaps also the helplessness in dealing with China. The news that a parliamentary research assistant has been arrested is a serious security threat, said opposition leader Keir Starmer at a debate in the House of Commons recently. The Labour leader blamed the Chinese security services for this. "We will defend our security," he said. The arrest of 2 people on suspicion of espionage took place in March, but the incident has only now become known, and the investigation is ongoing. One of the 2 people who worked in Parliament announced that she was innocent, and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak also addressed the media reports in the House of Commons. He said, "We will defend our democracy and our security." Yeah, but what does that mean? Politicians from the opposition, also from his own party, criticize the Prime Minister because, in their view, he is not doing enough to combat Chinese influence. Foreign Minister James Cleverly has just visited China. He replied to critics that he would not be credible if Great Britain turned away from the 2nd largest economic power. Criticisms of this course comes from Sir Ian Duncan Smith. The former Conservative Party leader has founded a parliamentary group on China, bringing together MPs from numerous countries and various parties. He says, "We have a problem with China, and all that concerns us is not to upset China." Duncan Smith's argument is held by the Sunak government's national security strategy. It says China is a challenge for security. This was formulated far too mildly, said the Conservative politician in an interview with the German medias in London. China is a threat, and this is how the United Kingdom must respond to China. In addition, the US has imposed sanctions on numerous Chinese people for human rights violations in Hong Kong and for the genocide of the Uyghurs, said Duncan Smith. The British government defends its course. After all, the Chinese company Huawei will be excluded from expanding the 5G mobile network, and it will be forbidden to install TikTok apps on government mobile phones. Sunak's predecessor, Boris Johnson, had taken an even tougher course against China. For example, he launched a visa program for Hong Kong Chinese who wanted to leave the country. Sunak announced a softer course when he took office in November 22. The key word is robust pragmatism. Duncan Smith calls this formulation absurd. You can't be pragmatic and robust at the same time. And this anti-government firestorm erupted over the weekend when London's Sunday Times reported that the researcher had been arrested along with another man earlier this year under Britain's official secrets law. The report said the researcher was in close contact with senior Conservative lawmakers before taking office, including Security Minister Tom Tugendhat. Government sources told CNN that Tugendhat has not had any contact with the person since he was appointed Security Minister. Prime Minister Sunak said he expressed very strong concerns about possible Chinese interference in British democracy during a meeting with Chinese Prime Minister Li Qiang at the G20 summit in the Indian capital New Delhi last weekend. The Chinese embassy in London rejected the espionage allegations, describing them as completely fabricated and nothing but malicious slander. The arrested researcher, who has not been named by most media organizations, released a statement through lawyers protesting innocence. London's Metropolitan Police said both men were being investigated by anti-terrorism police and had been released on bail until October. Although the investigation is ongoing, the incident sparked calls from a number of senior lawmakers, in the ruling Conservative Party for a tougher government stance towards China. Sunak's predecessor Liz Truss called on the government to officially classify China as a threat to Britain. She was joined by former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith, I mentioned earlier, and a number of other senior party members. British Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden said on Monday that there was a strong case for officially classifying China as a greater security risk than it currently is, although there were no clear signs the government planned to do so anytime soon. This view is not shared across the entire party, especially not in the government. Despite Sunak's condemnation of the alleged espionage, his spokesman has been emphatic that it would have no impact on immediate diplomatic relations, including whether or not China would be invited to the UK Artificial Intelligence Summit in November. The government's official position on China is complicated. As Foreign Secretary James Cleverly outlined earlier this year, the UK approach is three-pronged. First, we will strengthen our national security protections wherever Beijing's actions pose a threat to our people or our prosperity. Secondly, the UK will deepen our cooperation and strengthen our connection with our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. And the third pillar of our policy is to work directly with China bilaterally and multilaterally to maintain and create open, constructive and stable relationships that reflect China's global importance. Cleverly said in April, several months before his visit to Beijing in August, that he sent the Foreign Secretary to China for the first time in more than 5 years here. And not everyone within the government fully agrees with the approach set out by Cleverly. Multiple sources, including officials and ministers, have told CNN that they believe this policy is naive at best, as it could signal to Beijing that the UK will always be willing to make concessions no matter what China does. But back to the real question. Should the events of the last few days have an impact on official British policy? First, it's worth noting that the arrests in question took place in March of this year, so before Cleverly's visit to Beijing. So the government had long been aware of the problem. A number of MPs expressed anger that they were not informed of the arrests sooner. However, government officials told CNN it was standard practice not to comment on a live police operation. The British government is also aware of the fact that China, along with many other countries, both allies and adversaries, is engaged in espionage. Officials are watching it, they expect more of it, and they are raising the issue head-on, they say. This was reflected in the summer when Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee published a report detailing its view that China aims to target and influence people in the UK political system. And while these are serious allegations against the researcher for police to investigate, it is not entirely surprising that something like this could have taken place in Parliament or another official building. Parliament vets people who are issued passports through a system aimed at blocking people who may be vulnerable to pressure or undue influence, or have shown dishonesty or lack of integrity. If there are doubts about their reliability, then they might have exhibited behavior or suspected to it, due to circumstances that might otherwise indicate unreliability. On paper, this might look like it should cover anyone suspected of spying on the UK. In practice, vetting procedures will not always catch people who are determined to mislead. That was said by former British National Security Advisor Peter Ricketts. In our so open society, it's necessary that access to Parliament is broad. It is entirely possible that someone who is offered the chance to work as a researcher will not be subject to the same level of security as someone handling classified information. Unfortunately, this makes it even more difficult to stop those who want to abuse the trust of their colleagues, is what Ricketts told CNN. In other words, the allegations against this person are of course serious, but they also don't necessarily correspond to what one might imagine when the word spy is used. If this were true, it is plausible that it could have been so low and under the radar that security agencies would not have been able to detect this. The political culture in the United Kingdom also makes it a target for people who may wish to carry out espionage activities. Anyone who has a parliamentary card can easily make contacts. Not only are there several bars at Parliament that stay open late and serve subsidized alcohol, but pass holders can also bring guests onto the property. It is common to see young guests of ambitious politicians enjoying a drink on the terrace overlooking the Thames, chatting and taking in the impressive neo-Gothic surroundings there. It's a seductive environment for driven people, some less business-minded than others. Despite the arrests, observers believe it is unlikely that the British government's China policy will fundamentally change. There are few at senior political levels who seriously believe that a more hostile stance toward China will be beneficial to Britain in the long term. The UK has been on a journey in recent years in its rapprochement with China. As recently as 2015, British government leaders spoke of a golden era in relations between Britain and China. Beijing's security measures in Hong Kong, aggression in the South China Sea, threats against Taiwan, alleged human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims, support for Russia, and of course espionage allegations against Western countries have all contributed to increased hawkishness in Westminster. The UK has subsequently moved away from engaging China in things like critical national infrastructure. However, it is recognized that simply cutting China off from the UK will not help in certain key areas. For example, it will be impossible to cope with the pace of climate change because it needs China to burn less fossil fuels. And diplomats and officials believe a withdrawal with China would make that less likely. The allegations that China is spying on the United Kingdom, right at the heart of British democracy, are of course very worrying. But it will come as no surprise to the government, which has integrated it into British foreign policy. And at the moment, the UK certainly won't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we would say, when it's already on a delicate tightrope with a country the size and power of China. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.